Hello everyone and welcome, both new and old visitors alike. I know I've been away for a while, but I'm back now and that's what matters. Today we are starting a brand new journey and a brand new series, in fact. One full of fantasy, magic and wonder, meaning the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, published between 1950 and 1956. So, the Chronicles of Narnia are actually childhood favorites of mine, but as I've only ever read them as a child, I did read them in Swedish, as you can see here, so it will be the first time for me reading them in English, and I've been looking forward to doing that. A lot of things do get lost in translation, and there are many details in general that I don't even remember, particularly from the entries that were my least favorite growing up. Looking at you, Prince Caspian, but we'll get to you in due time. So yes, it will definitely be interesting revisiting these now as an adult. But with all of that being said, make sure you have some tea or any other cozy beverage of your choice, and let's get into the first installment of the Chronicles of Narnia. The Magician's Nephew. Chapter 1. Digory and Polly become friends. The story of Narnia begins at the very beginning, meaning before the creation of Narnia itself. The setting is Victorian London, where a young boy named Digory had just moved in with his uncle and aunt, Mr. and Miss Catterley, who were siblings and both unmarried. Digory's father was away in India and his mother had become terminally ill, which is why they had to move away from their house in the country and ended up with his mother's siblings in London. Digory was, understandably, very upset by his circumstances and had just been crying about it in the back garden when he met the girl living next door, Polly Plummer. She was kind to him and they began talking, and thus a strong friendship began to blossom. They started hanging out every day, and as it was a particularly rainy summer, they did a lot of indoor activities, such as exploration. During one such exploration exhibition of a dark attic passageway, the two children accidentally found themselves inside Digory's uncle's attic study, a room strictly forbidden for him to enter. It was filled with books, ink bottles, and other things that might belong in a study. But what was most curious was a bright red wooden tray on the table with sets of rings on it. The rings were laid out in pairs, a yellow one and a green one, each in bright shades. There was a strange humming sound coming from an unknown source, but aside from that, they appeared to be alone. But then the frightening, tall, skinny figure of Uncle Andrew rose out of a high-backed armchair, and he quickly locked the door and looked at the children with a greedy expression. They asked him to let them go, to which he replied that 2 children was exactly what he needed for his experiment. He then offered one of the colored rings to Polly, along with some flattery, which apparently worked like a charm, and Polly immediately brushed off all feelings of threat. But as she accepted one of the yellow rings, she immediately disappeared. Digory screamed, and Uncle Andrew put his hand over his mouth, reminded him that Digory's poor sick mother was downstairs and would be alarmed if he screamed. So naturally, Digory was silenced. Uncle Andrew then went on a long tangent, ignoring his nephew's repeating questions about what had happened to Polly, and he told him the history of his godmother, who had been a special individual and one of the last people in the country with fairy blood in them. Before she had died, she had asked Andrew to destroy a particular old box of unknown contents, which Andrew had, of course, ignored. Instead, he had studied the box and its contents, which was nothing but dust, really, but he found that it was a special kind of dust. During his experiments, he had used the dust to create the yellow and green rings, where the yellow ring will take you to another world and the green one will take you back home. But Polly hasn't got a green ring, says Digory, worried about his friend. And this was Uncle Andrew's plan all along. He hadn't dared to explore the rings himself and only sent guinea pigs who obviously couldn't take instruction nor tell him about their experiences. So now he was in need of human guinea pigs, meaning Polly and Digory. He tells Digory that he can get Polly back if he takes a yellow ring so that he can travel to wherever she is and bring 2 green rings with him for them both to return with. So Digory calls his uncle a beast, justifiably so, and reluctantly agrees to go after his friend. So he takes the rings. Chapter 2: The World Between Worlds. All of a sudden, Digory found himself underwater, rising to the surface. He appeared in a small pool, or spring, in a strange, dense forest. It was incredibly quiet, as there were no birds, insects, or even wind to break the silence. The trees had such thick canopies that you couldn't see the sky between the leaves, but a warm green light shone through regardless. The strangest thing was that there were more little pools surrounding him. His mind was a bit muddled, almost as if he had forgotten what he was doing there, or even who he was. He saw a girl laying on the grass close by, and this was of course Polly, but as the 2 children now had their minds muddled, it took them a while to remember who they were and how they had ended up there. They also saw one of the guinea pigs that Uncle Andrew had sent over there during his experiments, but they decided to leave it there, as it seemed quite content, and Uncle Andrew would surely just use it for experiments again if he got it back. They then re-entered the pool that they had come up from, but nothing happened, and that's when they realized that they were still wearing their yellow rings. But then Digory had an idea. Where did all the other pools lead? If that pool led back to their own world, the other pools might lead to other worlds. So they agreed to do some exploring before returning home. But Polly, being the sensible one, insisted that they double-check that they actually could go home, so they put on their green rings and jumped back into their home pool, and as they slowly saw London and Uncle Andrew's study forming before their eyes, they switched again to the yellow rings, which immediately brought them back to the forest. With this assurance, they marked their home pool and set off towards one of the others. Still wearing the yellow rings, they encountered another failure. Here's an interesting bit of lore, I suppose. The dust that had been used to create the rings originated from this forest between the worlds, and they worked similar to magnets, you could say. So the material in the yellow rings always wanted to go back to its home, meaning the forest, whereas the material in the green rings were repelled from its home, if that makes sense. So the children then tried the green rings and gave it another try, and this time it worked. They went under the surface and were on their way to another world. Chapter 3: The Queen of Charn. When they emerged, they were standing in a desolate courtyard with old stone buildings around them, mostly in ruins. The place was completely empty, but the most curious thing of all was the light. Despite the sky being almost black, there was a faint reddish light, as though from an invisible sunrise. Polly immediately expressed her dislike, but Digory was curious about it. The silence was eerie, not at all warm like the silence in the forest. This was just cold, dead, and empty. Polly immediately wanted to go back to the forest world, but Digory wanted to explore for a bit. After all, they just had to touch their yellow rings to go back, so what would be the harm? And reluctantly, Polly agreed. They began walking carefully around the desolate place. It appeared as though it had been abandoned for 1,000 years. On and on they walked through various courtyards, arches, and halls, until eventually they arrived at a door which stood ajar. Peering inside, they were both startled and taken aback. The room was full of people, perhaps hundreds, but a closer look showed that they were all perfectly still, and, as Polly immediately took note of, they all wore magnificent clothes. It was like an extravagant banquet of waxwork figures, all of them taller than the average human. So Digory and Polly walked along the seated figures, looking at their faces, clothes, and jewelry. Some looked happy and kind, while others looked cruel or despairing. But the last figure at the very end was the most interesting of them all. She was the most richly dressed and had a beautiful face which showed fierceness and pride. Behind her stood a pedestal with a small golden bell on it, along with a small golden hammer. There was an inscription on the side of the pedestal saying, "Make your choice, adventurous stranger, strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had." So this is basically a big red button with a sign that says, "I dare you to push the button." For Polly, this was an easy choice. We don't want any danger. But for Digory, the magic was already working on him. The curiosity was eating him up inside. So they start arguing, with Digory saying things like, "It's just because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged." And Polly responding with, "You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that." This went on for a while until Polly had had enough and began reaching for her yellow ring, but Digory stopped her and blocked her with his body as he quickly took up the golden hammer and gave the bell a light tap. Polly was furious, but they were soon distracted by the sound of the bell. Initially, it had been very soft, but the sound then grew louder and louder until it was so high that they couldn't even hear themselves screaming. And part of the ceiling collapsed, which covered the room in dust. Then the noise disappeared, but what followed was all the more interesting. The woman at the far end of the hall, the most extravagant and fierce-looking of them all, suddenly rose from her chair. As she stood up, the children realized just how tall she really was, and she walked over to them, demanding to know who had broken the spell that was on her. Digory answered sheepishly that it might have been him. She then took his chin in her hand and examined his face with piercing eyes, before concluding that he was no magician. They then revealed that they had come there through the magic of Uncle Andrew. But the palace continued to crumble, and the woman took one child in each hand as she led them out to safety. As they went, she gave them a passing tour of the palace, saying things like, "This was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles to a feast and killed them all before they had drunk their fill. They had had rebellious thoughts." Charming woman, isn't she? Eventually, they were blocked by heavy metal doors. The woman then let go of Digory's hand as she made the doors crumble into dust with an incantation. She told him, as they went through, that this is what happens to things and people who stand in her way. They reached an open overlook where they could see a big red sun and one lonely star in the sky above what had once been a great city, but was now nothing more but a crumbling ruin. The woman told them that it had been the city of Charn, which she had ruled over as queen. Jadis was her name, and it had been through her magic that the world had been destroyed. She had been at war with her sister for the throne, and in one last desperate act, as her sister was about to win the war, Jadis had cursed the whole world and everyone in it to die, apart from herself. That is when she had been frozen in time in the hall where the children had found her, until someone would strike the bell. Queen Jadis then went on to assume that Uncle Andrew must be a great king in his world, who must have seen Jadis in a magic mirror and been enchanted by her beauty. So obviously he had then used his magic to send his servants, meaning Digory and Polly, to bring her back to his world. The children denied this, of course, but Jadis wouldn't hear of it. Polly in particular were pretty vocal about the falseness of her assumption, which caused Jadis to let go of her hand to pull on Polly's hair. The children then saw their charms and immediately went for their yellow rings, which rested in their pockets. Chapter 4: Trouble in London. What the children didn't know was that you weren't required to have your own ring to travel between worlds. It was enough to just touch someone who had a ring. So, of course, Queen Jadis was able to go with them to the forest between worlds. Oddly enough, she was immediately weakened as they emerged there. She looked pale and was struggling to breathe. So Digory and Polly decided to leave her there and go back to their home world. But as soon as they had jumped into their home pool, Jadis had taken hold of Digory this time, and thus she came with them once more as they emerged back in Uncle Andrew's study. Next to her, Uncle Andrew became a stuttering mess. She demanded to see the magician whom she claimed had called her to this world, to which Uncle Andrew replied that must have been him. So she examined his face, just like she had done Digory's back in her home world, and concluded that, yes, he was a magician, but of a low sort. So she told him that she would allow him to be her servant, to which Uncle Andrew continued stuttering something about a pleasure to be of service. Jadis then went on to give him his first assignment. She needed transportation, so he was to acquire either a chariot, a flying carpet, a well-trained dragon, or whatever else was suitable for a royal in this world. She would then have to acquire clothes, jewelry, and slaves, and tomorrow she will start taking over the world. Uncle Andrew left the room saying he will get her a cab, but soon enough ended up in his bedroom, having himself a drink from a bottle he kept hidden in his wardrobe. Queen Jadis quickly grew impatient and went after Uncle Andrew to see what the holdup was. So Polly then left by the attic tunnel in the wall that they had come through to go back to her own house, and Digory was worried. Not only to be left with a crazy, terrifying witch queen in the house, but what if she found his sick mother? So Polly promised that she would be back soon to be supportive. Now, back to Uncle Andrew. He had had 2 drinks by now and had changed into his finest clothes and given himself a pep talk in the mirror. He then went downstairs, sent the maid to call for a cab, and went to his sister, Aunt Letty, asking to borrow some money. She refused, of course, and as they were arguing about this, the door flung open, revealing the terrifying Jadis, saying, "Now, slave, how long am I to wait for my chariot?" Now, Aunt Letty did not allow for such language in her house. Thinking that her brother had brought home some circus harlot with bare arms, she marched up to Queen Jadis and told her off. Jadis was furious and tried her well-known spell of turning things and people into dust. But alas, nothing happened, so she contented herself with throwing Letty across the room instead. But don't worry, she landed on the mattress that she was mending, so no harm done. Fortunately, that is when her cab arrived, so she and a defeated-looking Andrew left the house. They returned a while later with quite a lot of ruckus. Jadis was then standing on the roof of the carriage, fiercely whipping the poor horse as she drove like a crazy person, and the driver of said carriage followed behind along with several policemen and a curious crowd. Jadis crashed the carriage and jumped away from it, with a shaken-up Uncle Andrew emerging from the wreckage. Everything was a great mess. The police were trying to get information out of Andrew, quite in vain, as all he did was ask for a glass of brandy, and Jadis was now on the horse, proclaiming herself empress in front of the jeering crowd. Furious at them for not taking her seriously, she reached for a nearby lamppost and broke off one of the arms, showing off her unnatural strength. All the while, Polly and Digory had met up outside and was trying to get close enough to Jadis so that they could touch her, just as they would touch a yellow ring and thus get back to the forest between the worlds, and her out of London. It took a couple of tries, and one which had Jadis kick Digory in the face for trying to grab her, but they eventually succeeded, and in an instant the jeering mob in the street was replaced by the calmness of the forest. But this time they had more company than they had expected. Jadis had been sitting on the horse, so the horse came, of course, and the cab driver had been touching the horse to try and calm him. His name was Strawberry, by the way, which is just the sweetest name for a horse. And apparently Uncle Andrew had grabbed onto the cab driver, so they had all been affected by the magic ring. Digory and Polly then went into another pool of the forest and touched the green rings, but instead of appearing in some other unexplored world, everything went black and remained black. Chapter 5: The Awakening of Narnia. They could still feel each other's presence and hear each other speak, but their surroundings were pitch black. There was no sound, no wind, or anything. Digory wondered whether they were back in Charn, but during the night. But Jadis corrected him, saying, "No, this isn't Charn. This is an empty world. This is nothing." Not knowing whether he was dead or alive, given the odd circumstances, the cab driver decided to sing a hymn. The children joined him in the singing, but of course Andrew and Jadis remained silent. Shortly after this, another singing voice could be heard from somewhere far away. And it didn't take long for the source of the singing to appear. It was a lion, and in tune with the lion's song, the nothingness that surrounded them started to come to life. The sun began to rise, and grass and trees began to grow in front of their very eyes. All the while, the lion moved closer to the group, and Jadis threw her lamppost arm at him in desperation, but alas, it only bounced off him, and he continued his singing. So Jadis went off to hide among the trees. That's when Digory noticed something interesting. In the exact spot where the arm of the lamppost had fallen, a brand new lamppost was now growing, just like a tree. This fascinated everyone, and Uncle Andrew in particular. He began rambling about the magic of this land and how he could benefit financially from it. Imagine if anything you planted there would grow anew. He also felt the climate as perfect. He felt younger already. Maybe this was the land of youth. This particular comment sparked Digory's attention, as he was thinking about his terminally ill mother. If this really was the land of youth, maybe there was something here that could help her. He decided to ask the lion about it, but at that moment, the lion was rather busy creating wildlife. All manner of animals began spurting from the ground, and the lion then chose 2 from each species, and they were to join him while the other animals went off to do their own thing. The chosen animals had been given voices and were now talking animals. The lion greeted them, and they responded with, "Hail Aslan, we hear and obey, we are awake, we love, we think, we speak, we know." The lion meaning Aslan, then went on to call some of the talking animals to his council. As he explained, the world of Narnia is only a few hours old, but an evil had already entered it. So Aslan and his council walk a bit further away from the others to, I suppose, discuss this matter. Digory explains to Polly and the cabman how he needs to get to the lion to ask about a cure for his mother. So the cabman, after a brief but interesting conversation with his horse, Strawberry, who is now a talking horse, got Strawberry to agree to let Digory ride on his back to get to Aslan. Aslan's council came to an end just as Digory approached them, and Aslan called him forth. Digory asked him shyly whether he might have something to help his sick mother back home, but Aslan had another thing in mind. He asked Digory, in front of his council, how the evil witch had managed to get there, and Digory felt like he had to tell the truth. So he admitted that it had been his fault for waking up the witch in the first place, as he had struck the bell in the banquet hall in Charn. Aslan then said that as it was the fault of him, a son of Adam, as he called him, that the witch had come to Narnia, he had to help deal with her. Which only seems fair, to be honest. But first, Aslan turned to the cabman, and he asked him whether he liked it there in Narnia and whether he'd like to stay. The cabman said that he liked it very much, and if only he had his wife there, they would have loved to stay. Aslan then did some more song magic, and all of a sudden, the cabman's wife was standing right there with her little apron on and with soap studs on her arms. Oddly enough, she did not seem particularly alarmed by this sudden change of scenery. Aslan then proclaimed that the cabman and his wife, called Frank and Helen, will be the first king and queen of Narnia, and that their children and grandchildren will continue to rule both Narnia as well as the neighboring country of Archenland. This is not as random as it sounds, because throughout the story, the cabman, Frank, has been a very reasonable character with a good sense for fairness and treating others well, whether they be human or animal. So I do like it, it makes sense. But anyway, now Aslan turned back to Digory to give him his task. As the witch was now free roaming the land, he wanted to plant a tree which would magically keep her away. So Digory was to travel across the mountains to a valley with a lake, and there he was to pick an apple from a garden and bring it back to Aslan. He then turned to the horse, Strawberry, and asked whether he'd like to be a winged horse. Strawberry was of course very excited and agreed, so Aslan gave him beautiful feathered wings and asked him to take Digory where he needed to go. Oh, and he also gave him a new name, Fledge. Yes, Fledge. Fledge. I think I'll stick with Strawberry. Polly wanted to accompany Digory as well, so the cabman, now King Frank, helped the two children up on Strawberry's back, and off they went into the sky. Chapter 6. The Fruit of Youth. They flew all evening, crossing forests and mountains, before settling down to rest for the night. Strawberry was quite happy eating the grass, telling the children to help themselves. It was very good grass. But children can't eat that. Thankfully, Polly had some toffee in her pocket that she shared with Digory, and they made sure to plant the last piece of toffee they had in the ground. After all, a piece of a lamppost arm had grown a brand new lamppost, so there was no harm in trying. They then struggled up next to Strawberry and had a decently good night's sleep. The next morning, the toffee they had planted had grown into a full tree, along with toffee-like fruits which were sweet and juicy. Even Strawberry tried the fruit, but he said he preferred grass this early in the morning. Had to take a tiny bit of a break to charge the battery. And now I have switched out my tea for some iced tea because it is very warm. But let's continue. So the journey then continued as Strawberry and the children flew over the beautiful landscape until they were struck by a strong but heavenly scent of fruits and flowers. It came from below, where there was a garden on top of a steep hill, and they landed there, and Digory immediately understood that this was their destination. The garden had a golden gate with an inscription similar to the one with the bell in the ruined city of Charn. The inscription read, "Come in by the gold gates, or not at all. Take of my fruit, for others or forbear. For those who steal, or those who climb my wall, shall find their heart's desire, and find despair." So then Digory went in alone, and quickly found the apple tree that Aslan had sent him there for. It had silver apples on it, and they smelled absolutely wonderful. He picked one and put it in his pocket to bring back to Aslan. The temptation to try one was great, but Digory pushed himself to leave it. But as he was about to leave again, he realized that he wasn't alone. The witch was standing nearby and throwing an apple core to the side as she had just finished eating it. The apple might have been silver in color, but the juice must have been dark, as could be seen around Jadis's mouth. It made her face look all the more white. Digory ran back to the others, urging them to get away, but the witch Jadis followed behind. She called out for him and began to tempt him, saying that if he took an apple for himself and ate it, he could remain young forever. The two of them could go on to rule this country, or any country, and go on to live forever. This didn't work on Digory though, as he wasn't the type to be tempted by power. She then switched her tactic and saying that she should take an apple not for himself, but for his sick mother. She would surely die without it. Now, this was Digory's sensitive spot. He hesitated for a while, as he well and truly wanted to bring an apple back to his mother, but her lessons sat deep within him, not to steal and not to break promises. So he resisted the temptation, and the children returned with the apple to Aslan. So, what happened to Uncle Andrew while Digory and Polly was away? Well, he had been handled rather roughly by the talking animals, as they had tried to figure out what he was. So by the time the children had returned, he was pretty traumatized. Aslan commended Digory for a job well done and instructed him where to plant the apple, and he obeyed. Aslan then went on to explain that the witch, Jadis, had fled north and won't come down to Narnia as long as this tree stands. She had already eaten its fruit, yes, but as the inscription on the Golden Gate had said, she found both eternal youth as well as the eternal despair. And it's because of this that she will not want to get close to even the smell of the fruit ever again. So yeah, a new tree had then sprung up from the apple Digory had planted, and Aslan gave Digory permission to pick another apple to bring back for his mother. It won't give her eternal youth, but it will heal her from her illness. So Digory picks one from the tree, and shortly thereafter, he, Polly, and a sleeping Uncle Andrew were back in the forest between the worlds with Aslan. Aslan then gives them one warning and one command. The command was simple. They are to take the remaining magical rings and bury them so that they won't be used again. The warning, however, is that their own world, meaning our real-life world, is on the same track as Charn in terms of tyrannical leaders gaining the power to essentially destroy the whole world. I don't know if this is some commentary on nuclear warfare or something. It's a rather heavy thing to say to these two 11-year-olds. I mean, it's not like they can do anything about it. But yeah. Chapter 7, Returning Home. Then the children and Uncle Andrew were suddenly back on the pavement outside of their London townhouse. Everything was just the way that they had left it. The crowd and the police were still there, but of course no witch, no horse, or no cabman. And Uncle Andrew wasted no time. He bolted for his bedroom and a certain hidden bottle in his wardrobe. Meanwhile, Polly went for the attic to get the remaining magical rings before Andrew could get to them. Although, to be fair, there was hardly any risk of that. And Digory, of course, went to see his mother. He had brought the apple, which in this world was no longer silver, but instead the most vibrant red color. He fed her the apple, and afterwards they buried the apple core along with the magical rings in the back garden. Within weeks, his mother's health was completely restored. The doctor declared it a miracle. Digory's father also returned from India after getting an unexpected inheritance, so the family were able to move out to a large country estate. They let Uncle Andrew move in there with them, as Digory's parents felt guilty that poor Aunt Letty had been made to handle him all by herself for so long. But Uncle Andrew actually became a nice old man, but he would often take visitors to the billiard room where he would tell stories about a mysterious woman of foreign royalty whom he had entertained in London one time. In the garden of the London townhouse, the apple core grew into a nice apple tree. Even though the tree and the fruit was no longer magical, it never forgot its sibling back in Narnia. Sometimes it would move mysteriously even when there was no wind. One day, when Digory was a middle-aged man, a great storm felled the apple tree. As this was a precious tree, Digory made sure to salvage some of the timber and used it to create a wardrobe, which he then placed in his country estate home. Back in Narnia, King Frank and Queen Helen lived happily ever after, and their firstborn son became the next king of Narnia, and their second son became king of Archenland. So their sons had gone on to marry nymphs, and their daughters had married wood gods and river gods. Given that there were no other humans around, this was a good thing to clear up. Many happy and peaceful years went by, and the lamppost continued shining day and night in the forest. The end. Chapter 8, My Thoughts. So that was the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and it is a rather unique little story. It reads to me like a mix between a traditional portal fantasy and a Book of Genesis type of story. The Christian connotations are many, and in this one in particular, but also in some of the other books, which we will get to eventually. As a child, I didn't really put any thoughts into the religious themes. Maybe because I grew up in a secular society and was completely indifferent to religion in general. But now, reading it as an adult, the Christian themes are very obvious and even somewhat jarring. Because on the one hand, reading fantasy is in itself an escapist act, whereas Christianity is so heavily connected with the real world we live in. Anyway, I wanted to talk about the setting. I love that this book had Victorian England as its main sort of main setting. It's so lovely because there are so many details in the book that really captures the historical feel of that time period. C.S. Lewis was born in 1898, so he didn't personally have any memories of living during that time, but he's still close enough to it to have known what it would have been like. So in writing this historical setting, he does it with the assumption that the reader doesn't know much about it and includes so many charming details that really helps with the immersion. For example, during all of the turmoil taking place in the London townhouse when Jadis was there, every time the housemaid was mentioned, he says in brackets things like, "the housemaid who had a particularly exciting day," or "what a day she was having." This is a small but recurring detail that comes up every time the housemaid is mentioned, making a point to the reader that the life of a Victorian housemaid was usually quite monotone. Does it have to be there? No, but having it there really helps with the immersion of the setting. And this type of charming narration style is very prevalent throughout the Narnia books, so I'm sure I'll bring up more examples as we go through them all. So with my initial thoughts out of the way, let's go through some of my likes and dislikes from the book. What I liked. Number 1. Digory tells Polly about his weird uncle who spends most of his time up in the attic, and Polly's first thought is, maybe he keeps a mad wife up there. And Digory says, yeah, I've thought of that. Whether this is deliberate or not, I feel like it's a reference to Jane Eyre, and that completely went over my head as a child, and I love it. So there's that. Plain and simple. 2. There are some very creative swear words used throughout the book series, and I am indeed compiling a list of my favorites, so this one will be continued. Number 3. Uncle Andrew. He's my favorite character. He has the most personality, and his reactions to the witch Jadis's behavior in London are absolutely amazing. Number 4. The world of Charn is fascinating. Even as a child, this section of the book was actually my favorite. I love the mystery as the children walk around the ruins and the banquet hall with the wax figures or whatever it was. It tickles my imagination, and I love it. I love it still. What I disliked. Number 1, a singing lion. I'm sorry, but that's just too much for my visualizing brain to handle without crashing. Number 2, and this ties into the first one, but I struggle a bit with the talking animals thing. It works perfectly well for a children's story, don't get me wrong, but me reading this alone as an adult, it gets a bit too much at times. Number 3, Jadis is a bit one-dimensional as a villain. If you have a list of stereotypical villain motives, Jadis would likely check off all of them. A desire for world domination, seeing other people as less worthy, using threats to exert control. The list could go on. But yes, there we have it. Overall, I very much enjoyed revisiting this book, and I would very much like to know what you all think, both of the book or the video. Please leave any and all of your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It helps me out so much, so thank you in advance for that. And yeah, I hope to see you back for when we talk about book 2, which is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So until next time, take care everyone.